Okay, everyone. Well, we're going to get going. We're just over half the number of people there in the first couple minutes. I'm talking anyway, so no one's really interested in that. So I'll just get going and then everybody else will get in and we'll be on our way. So welcome to our second online forum on racism. As I mentioned, I think there's about 100 people who have signed up for this. Let me give you my little 2-cent encouragement before we jump in with Allison and Sharon. And my encouragement is simply to stay in the conversation, to recognize that the topic is challenging, it's difficult, it can be disruptive. And my encouragement is to stay in the conversation. Let's keep the conversation going. Let's keep listening to each other. And most especially, let's stay humble as we engage in these difficult conversations. The beauty of this is in our services and in the culture of our congregation, we have talked about difficult conversations. We've talked about the importance of pulling up a chair and being with each other in these things. And we're trying to do that in real time, in a real way, on a real subject. So again, things will get said tonight you may not agree with. I'm sure that will happen. You may be shaking your computer or your device to scream out an alternative opinion. I understand that. We get that. We're going to do our best to try to walk into this with humility and do the best we can to talk through these tough issues, but they are tough issues. So I just hope you'll stay with it and we stay with it as a congregation as we look to Jesus to be at work within us, to be transforming us to be his people. I hope you had a chance to read the things we asked you to read in preparation for this, the article by N.T. Wright and the letter from a Birmingham jail by Martin Luther King Jr. Both of those things are going to help give shape to our discussion tonight. And both of those pieces remind us of how important this topic is for Christ followers. But reading through those pieces, struggling with reading through those pieces also reminds us of the engagement, the work, the effort required to live out our faith in this fractured world. So I hope you had a chance to read that. Many of you know our two panelists tonight, but let me introduce them quickly. Sharon Richards, give a wave there, Sharon, so people know who you are. Sharon Richards, longtime Oak Hillian, been a leader in our church for a long time, an important voice in our church for a long time on a wide variety of issues, is currently an elder in our church and one of the important leaders in our church on racial issues. So we're grateful for Sharon being here. The other panelist tonight is Allison Carlos. Give a wave, Allison. Allison is all the way out in Durham, North Carolina. So it's going on 10:15 for Allison. We appreciate her staying up. Allison is also a longtime Oak Hillian. Some of you may know 3 or so years ago, she moved out to Durham to attend Duke Divinity School. And a few months ago, she graduated in one of their master's programs at Duke Divinity School. So we are glad, Allison, that you are with us as well. Quickly on the format for tonight, we have a whole bunch of questions that I'm gonna rapid fire throw out to both Allison and to Sharon to keep this conversation going, to keep exploring this. We asked you to submit questions that you may have, and a number of you did write in questions and send them to us, and we've worked in as many of those as we could into our discussion tonight. Like I said, we probably have more questions than we have time to address them. We'll do our best. This should be about an hour and a half to 2 hours long once we're done. So let's get into it. And one of the things that we all know about this particular subject is here we are again, and there's things that have happened recently in our country, and the topic of racism is in front of us again. It has been in front of us for quite some time, and conversations have happened, and things are being talked about in the media and in individual discussions. And we've talked a lot about this at church. And so Sharon, let me just start with you as we think about this kind of forum for Oak Hills. Why are we doing these conversations? Why, in your mind, is it important we keep talking about this?
Well, for starters, the race is such a huge topic, even as of an hour ago. And it's a topic that is divisive, and it's tearing apart our country. There's global connections as well. And so as Christ followers, I think it's important for us to get comfortable with having difficult conversations, and this is a difficult one. I feel really proud of Oak Hills and their willingness to even have this kind of forum that we can talk about these things, that we can sit around the kitchen table and hash this stuff out, recognizing that we're not going to solve anything, but hopefully we can at least get us a little bit closer to where we should land as it relates to our belief in Jesus. So from my perspective, I cannot separate my belief, who I'm trying to be, who I'm called to be as a Christ follower, and race or any of these other hot topics that are out there in our world. Jesus is the banner over everything. So my hope as we have this conversation and any others in the future is that we would keep him at the forefront, and that we would recognize that what we are called to do is to follow Christ. And so part of that means we enter into tough conversations with humility and with teachable hearts, and we look to him as our example for this issue, this problem, getting comfortable with the uncomfortable, being okay with not necessarily agreeing, but can we agree that Jesus is Lord? Can we agree on that? Let's start there.
Good.
Yeah. Can I add to that, Sharon? Because that's a big amen. And big, and you know, the passion too in that is that we are recognizing that this country, in the beginning of our country, and the society has always been bent towards racial ideology, and in the way we practice, and that has thwarted the mutuality for people of color, Black people in particularly. So that arc has bent, and we still, it's less acute today than it was than periods of time. And there's an inclination to have that victory lap. We've had the Black president. It's all wonderful things that in that regard. So for Christians, and to your point, if racism is a kind of sin, it continues to disfigure the church. And that's the Church of Jesus Christ, that Sharon, that you're talking about. So Christians manifesting a purpose that is antithetical to that is a loss, and Martin Luther King said it, loss of our authenticity. We become inept in purpose, and we lose sacrificial spirit. So I agree with you. It is all about Jesus. So thank you.
Good. So let's drop down a notch, kind of right out of the gate here. Venture into some specifics, if one or both of you are willing. In terms of this, and Allison, I'll just direct this toward you. Before we get into a lot of the other questions, in terms of your own experience, your own life, in what ways that you're comfortable in sharing have you experienced racism?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think that first, I always like to say that when I talk about my racial experiences, I like to distinguish on what I'm saying, because we'll talk about it, I'm sure, sometime. There's a difference between someone making a racist statement to someone and there being a racial context and content to what's happening. So I'm going to try to distinguish that with a couple of examples, if that's helpful. And I always want to say my heart is that we are communicating, like Sharon said. That's the purpose in this for me, to learn. So a first racial encounter I had, and it's the earliest experience I had was when I was about 8 years old. I grew up in Los Angeles, and my mom, we had moved, and my mom had taken me out trick-or-treating. We were in a kind of a new neighborhood. Anyway, I walked up, I had gotten dressed in a particular costume because it was something that meant something to me. I walked up to the door, and the man opened it, a white man, and he looked at me and he said, "What are you supposed to be?" I said, "Well, I'm a go-go girl." And I smiled. And he got the candy, and then he dropped it in my bag, and he said, "Don't you know there are no Black go-go girls?" And I remember that feeling like it was yesterday. I can remember the front porch. I can remember his yard. And I remember backing away from that front door because I immediately began to understand something I never knew before, that there was something in this world that was relatively unsafe for me. I had no context for it. I didn't talk to my mother about it. I just told her I wanted to go home because that bag of candy now felt like it had a lead brick in it. I didn't care about the candy. I didn't care about the fun. Something had changed. And so when we really don't know what it is that can cause a person to remember something that defines them. And I think that's what's sort of missing in this conversation. We don't necessarily give credence to sometimes what affects a person throughout their life, because what that did is it racialized my life. It racialized my life. So that's one example I will provide for you. In contrast to that, I'll talk about one that is a noodle twister for me, okay? What has repeatedly happened to me throughout my life, and predominantly as an adult, is a certain kind of person, and it's always not a person of color. It's usually a person who's white. For some reason, they feel, what happens is they will not necessarily be a friend, but an associate, or a colleague, or even an acquaintance. And at a most inopportune time, they'll say to me, "What are you?" And it has to do with racial ambiguity. What are you? And what happens in that circumstance is I immediately because this has been a lifelong exposure, I immediately say in my head, where am I going to end up now with this person that I had some trust with? I know we were both standing in a building. We were both we were on the 15th floor. Am I going to end up on the 12th floor, the 6th floor, the 2nd floor, or the noodle twister is an 18th floor? And so the result for that for me has been feeling that for some reason, there's a privilege out there that feels entitled to ask me a what of identity for me. What are you? And what that does is it exotifies me, and it tells me there's something subnormative going on about my person, something subnormative. So those are a couple of examples. Also, my husband, who he presents white, he's white and Mexican, or white and Spanish mainly. We built a house in El Dorado Hills. We were given a lot of grief by the association, finally culminating in someone telling us, just don't hire any Mexican people. And so these things, that was a racist comment within the sphere of racial content of the culture. Okay. So there's a couple examples.
Wow, thank you, Allison.
So I'm going to share some of the feedback that we received from the first Pull Up a Chair is that people really wanted for me to provide an example of racism. And frankly, I had been, and to some degree still am, reluctant to share a personal example because there's a lot of pain there. And I didn't want to share and have what I share be judged or minimized by people who don't know me or don't know my story, or by people that push against the very notion that racism exists, or that I didn't want to share my pain with people who just don't even want to talk about race anymore. That being said, I'm going to share something, and I'm going to do an abbreviated version of this, but let me just say that 1992, my husband and I bought a house in Folsom, and we were very excited. We were in escrow, and one evening we decided we were going to drive by the house and look at it again, and we were getting really excited about things. We drove down East Bidwell, and we saw where Wells Fargo is, Taco Bell, and all these different places, what restaurants we would try. We were really excited about our new neighborhood. And we were just driving around Folsom, and before we know it, there's the flashers, and we get pulled over. And my husband is asked to get out of our vehicle, and he walks to the back of the car. And in any case, what ended up happening was someone called the cops because they felt threatened by our presence there. And if you think about a balloon, just the air going out of a balloon, I mean, that was, I just remember just driving home going, oh my gosh, what are we signed up for? And I can tell you that it was a long, long time that I would leave my front door of my house in Lexington Hills, that I didn't turn and look at my garage door to see if there's anything written on it, spray painted on it, that I didn't look at the tree in my front yard and expect something. There's going to be some of you that are going to say, well, Sharon, that was 1992. That is true. But these things still happen. And if, I've got a quiver full of these kinds of stories. Let me just say this. If you want to get a more recent one, or another example might be my kids' experience at Folsom Middle School. Another one can be a family experience at Vista del Lago High School. So I'm saying this to say, don't think because you don't see it, it's not happening. I'll leave it at that.
Okay, thank you to both of you. I know that's, we're in this weird online thing that's extraordinarily vulnerable of both of you, and I appreciate the risk you both took there. One of the articles we sent out was by N.T. Wright, a scholar who's written widely on a variety of topics. I hope those of you who are tuned in had a chance to read that. I know it's not People magazine level, but it is, there's a lot of stuff in that article that he wrote that is extremely important, shaping, challenging, both to us individually as Christians and to us as a local congregation at Oak Hill. So if you haven't had a chance to read it, I would urge you to read it. But Allison, one of the things he says in that essay, and what I'd like to ask you to do is take this phrase and sort of fan it out into this topic we're considering tonight. The phrase he uses, Jesus is Lord, Caesar is not. So help us understand what he means and how it impacts what we're talking about.
Yeah. Yeah. That was one of my favorite lines. You know, Jesus is Lord. Lord is the first creed ever really written. First proclaiming statement for what God was doing, who God is, what He's doing with humanity, and for the Christian, for the believer in Jesus Christ. So what I would like to do on that question is, could I start with what it's leading up to Jesus is Lord, and explain what I understand N.T. Wright is doing in that. He's telling us that it's kind of a critique and indictment on what is happening and has happened in America and the church, and that whatever is happening has resulted in perhaps forgetting the church, forgetting that Jesus is Lord. The Shema statement is, hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one God, and that is proclaimed as the precursor to Jesus is Lord. So there's really two ways Christians can look at how racism is, and I'll get to this thing of Jesus is Lord, as a societal response and a Christian response. And N.T.'s saying, let's look at both. I like the way Walter Brueggemann talks about this and explains the fullness. The crisis in the United States church, he says, has almost nothing to do with being liberal or conservative. It has everything to do with giving up the faith and discipline of our Christian baptism and settling for a common generic US identity. That is part patriotism, part consumerism, part violence, and part affluence. So N.T. is telling us that what's happened in America is that we have adopted what is an Enlightenment kind of philosophy, a Hellenistic philosophy. And the result of that has led us to high degrees of individualism, sense of freedom, rights, triumphalism, and nationalism. Now, we may not all believe that just on the face value, but it's fostered our alliance with it, which instinctively questions, do we believe that Jesus is Lord, right? I could tell you a lot about where, that started in American history, and we can see the movements of it that have gotten us to where we are. But when what he's also saying is on the racism issue, when you have seen that, in fact, the church is complicit in recognizing Blacks as inferior, as an inferior race, and that's perpetuated through many decades, centuries. And it has, because you can see it manifesting in the churches up through, quite pointedly, through the 1970s, 1980s, especially in the South. So these patterns of what he calls dualism, that are doctrines that have held up this ideal that we're we need to be focused on what happens in the afterlife, kind of robs us of the fullness of what living as if Jesus is Lord looks like, which is sort of the embodied presence of the church here, right?
So let me jump in on that, Allison. So is to sort of summarize this, part of what I hear you saying is that for those of us who are Christians, the idea that Jesus is Lord, the creed that Jesus is Lord, the profession that Jesus is Lord, we just have to face reality. There are things embedded in our DNA and in sort of in the environment that we take as normal and typical that can be undercutting this idea and our own living out of Jesus being Lord.
Yeah, I mean, the question becomes one of, do we think, and we can talk in detail, but do we think Jesus is Lord, or are the practices that you're talking about of us individually and as churches, more like Jesus is Lord when Caesar says so. I mean, that's one that I, I kind of float out there. Is Jesus Lord because a political party has said so? Is Jesus Lord because I have adopted a particular ideology? And what he's being very clear about is that our sense of ideological passion and vigor is idolatry. We are actually doing something antithetical to what is Christian. But it has been looming for so long that we aren't recognizing it. And, candidly, the church isn't speaking against it. And so this goes beyond racism. This goes to so many things that we're accepting, right? Yeah. Because and one of Jesus's primary tenets is he cares about justice. He cares about social justice. He cares about the things that humans are experiencing on the margins. And so if we're ignoring claims and calls for that, then it is antithetical to the Christian.
Good. And again, these are hard things that we're talking about here, but what I hear you saying, and again, I feel this in my own heart as you're speaking, is this idea of Jesus being Lord. There's an all-inclusiveness to that. We're talking about it in the context of racism, but it kind of goes back to what Sharon started with in terms of, this is integrated into our walk with Christ and our life with God, that says we are seeking to live as people who follow him as King, as Lord, over everything. So there is a collision here, and just to name it and acknowledge it, there's a collision here that many of us may feel, and it's a good thing to feel because it means we're recognizing the magnitude of the claim Jesus is Lord.
Yeah. And
Okay, so the obvious, there's three of us on the screen. The obvious thing is, as both of you have emphasized the last few days in talking about this, the obvious thing is I'm the old white guy. And again, I want to underscore, you both have emphasized this a few times. I'm not sure why. But so we got to talk about this. We have to talk about, I've experienced it in myself. I've heard others express this in our church as this topic has come up. And we all know defensiveness is an issue, is my point. The defensiveness, I've felt defensive. People that I've interacted with in our church sometimes feel defensive around this. One of the hurdles that I think those of us who are white feel in this discussion is sometimes we feel attacked. Sometimes we feel this sense that nothing we can say, nothing we can do is going to overcome the sense that, well, you have privilege and there's racial things running through you and all that stuff. So this idea of defensiveness that comes up, and so Allison, let me stay with you for a second. When as we think about this, just to put it in these terms, why is there so much focus on white people and what white people do or don't do relative to racism? Give us a short sort of your perspective on it. Always seems to come to what we do or don't do. What's up with that?
Yeah. Well, okay. I've come to think that the answer lies in plain sight. I have to say this, all my friends out there, I hate using this term white people. And Mike will remember years ago, I told him, the worst thing that could happen is we could start demonizing people. And I just don't want anybody to hear that out of my mouth as weaponry, okay? So I've come to believe that the answer lies in plain sight. And that is that people constitute, white people constitute the dominating group in our culture, yesterday and today. And so if that's true, And I mean, politically, educationally, social power. So if that's true, then those are the power brokers. And so you can't not be at the table. You can't not be at the table. Whether or not you feel reverse discrimination, I'll just say it that way. I know that's a real deal. That I understand that. And I think it's so important to say that when we're talking about this, I know I'm not, and I know a lot of people are saying white people do not have difficulties in life and that you get dealt a blow. What I think the point is here is that white people are important because it's been the dominating group. And I think it's a matter of you seeing how your skin color has never been an impediment culturally to your life or had made it any more difficult. So that's what I would say about it quickly.
All right. Sharon, you got anything to add to that?
I can't, that was beautiful. I can't really add anything more to that.
All right. So let's stay in similar theme related to this topic. And this was one of the questions that came in, and so we grappled with this, the three of us, a bit earlier. But I want to throw this out because I think this is something that people wonder, and I'll put it in both ways, and then you guys can take it however you want and try to respond. So one way to put it is white privilege unavoidable for anyone who is white? Another way that the question was put by the person who submitted it, are all white people guilty of white privilege?
I hope you heard that huge sigh.
Well, I think we all heard it, Sharon. No, don't doubt that.
Because that, I mean, we could spin off on that for a long, long time. And I hesitate to say yes or no. And if I don't, then it might feel like I'm not answering the question. What I will say, or how I will answer it, is that there are certain, I think Allison said it earlier, there are certain privileges that go with being white, regardless of your socioeconomic situation. And that has just to do with skin tone. That's all there is to it. And I can't clean it up any other way. I don't like the word guilty because that heaps unfair responsibility on someone when they start, you know, I was born white, you were born black, those kinds of things. But I think what's important is that you recognize that there are certain power structures that are in place, and those people that are in places of power should be using those power places for shalom, for equity, for peace. Recognize where you have your strengths and think of all people as you wield that power and start to give up some of that.
Okay.
Go back. I mean, I know this, I hate to say this sounds like a broken record, but go back to Jesus.
Yeah.
You know, go back to
Okay.
him, follow his example, you know.
So you both have said something in response to the last two things we talked about that I hear that's important, and it is linking power and this whole issue, this whole conversation and whole issue of racism. I mean, so Allison, you want to just flesh that out a bit?
Yeah. I tell people I like to start off this time about, you know, what's, you know, supremacy is just one group, one racial group who thinks that, you know, they're better than another group, right? So technically there could be different races who do that, right? but being the dominant group and being historical with racial issues, we'll call it, white supremacy. And it functions in society as more direct. Privilege is an outcome of sort of a supremacy culture or supremacy situation. And what privilege does is it acknowledges power and control and how it operates by economics, wealth, and it helps with identity. In other words, privilege is about, in some respects, about identity. And where this kind of gets really kind of wacky is way back when there have always been poor white people with us. People struggle, but poor white people during the antebellum period were so happy to be able to say, but I'm not Black. And so what happens when that's enculturated is that there is a sense of, I'm just better than you are. I'm just better. Maybe you can't put, no, I'm not talking about you guys, okay? I'm just saying when that's happening, words may not be easily applied, but that's what's happening. And it's an oppression, it's ideological oppression, I would call it.
Okay, I get it. That's helpful. And just to sort of insert my own voice here for a second, I know you both well enough to know, and I feel this as a white pastor in a suburban church. Our purpose in these discussions and my purpose in whatever we've talked about at Oak Hills about this is certainly not to sort of create some sort of collective oppressive shame or guilt over the color of my skin or the color of many of us at Oak Hills. That's not the point. The point of this really is we have spent so much time over the years talking about spiritual formation, Christ-likeness, and the kingdom making its way into the details and the deep places of our individual lives and hearts and of our communal life and heart to shape us as Christ's people. And so I know you both that in talking about this, we're not trying to trigger defensiveness. We're not trying to just leave it in this spot of, boy, you're the color of your skin is white, therefore you're this. That has nothing to do with this. So it's important to keep, as we sit in this and as we struggle with this, that we, as a local congregation, continue to want to be on our way to Christ being formed in us. And there's all that's going on has opened up a space to talk about this in detail and bring this down into a real deep space. And again, not that everybody agrees, it's not that we're all in the same spot, it's that we're in it and we're sorting it out and we're struggling through it. So staying in that mode for a moment, I do sense sometimes that people feel there's a little bit, perhaps a bit of an eye roll, a bit of, oh my goodness, here we go again, we're gonna talk about this again. Or, I know that sometimes there's the thought, okay, you just mentioned the time of slavery, Allison. Okay, granted, awful. I'm playing a little bit here, just pushing a bit, awful. I know people feel this way. That was terrible. You're certainly not suggesting we haven't progressed since then. Go back to the 60s. We've got legislation that was put in place in the 60s. You're certainly not suggesting we haven't moved and grown and learned and are making progress. And I recognize, Sharon said this last time, and it was a powerful statement, that me or someone like me, even putting it this way, is an expression of white privilege. In other words, we've made progress. Isn't that good enough for you? I get that. I understand that. But I guess the question is, Allison, why is this still on the table? Not just on the table, but fairly central on the table.
Yeah.
Like I said, no one that's sitting here participated in slavery. No one tuning into this has owned a slave. We've all seen civil rights laws, progress has been made. Why are we still so into this?
Yeah. One of the things that what I'll start with is we have made, there's been progress. Okay, I want to say that, but I like these words that were spoken by Baldwin. He basically said, when Bobby Kennedy said at one of his platform speeches for president, when he was running, he said, you know, in another 40 years, Black folks will be able to be president. And James Baldwin said, wow, you know, they just kind of got off the boat, the Kennedys, and they're here and they're president, and they're telling people who've been here for centuries to wait. So that kind of characterizes things. And also I want to say, we're fairly proximate to something that has happened over 400 years. We're fairly proximate not only to the civil rights and movement and emancipation. I'll give you one piece of information that was helpful for me. I realized recently that my husband and I, we're an interracial couple. When just 16 short years before we actually got married, in 16 states in this country, there were miscegeneration laws on the books, anti-interracial laws on the books, which is 30% of this country. And so 16 years is not a long time. And so I think we have to realize that we still are talking about it because it is not that far from our history, and we are still feeling the effects of it. The other thing I want to say on is, one of the things that has been very helpful for me to learn is how people hear about the discussion of racism. For people who experience racism, they have a sense of what is happening within the systems around them, the culture. If you aren't a direct recipient of racism, what tends to happen is you see racism as an exact act of prejudice by a person. And so it kind of makes some sense when we go, why are we still talking about this? Because it doesn't really, how can it really exist to the strength it was? There aren't a lot of people who actually walk around making racist statements. And so it kind of gets out of view that way. But it's the way we hear the words. And also, if we start to understand it less about a person being unworthy because of their skin color, being white, okay, or guilty, it really is an issue of how we've constructed our society to value power, wealth, control, and I say this tenderly, the preservation of identity.
Good. That's helpful. Sharon, one of the articles we sent out was the letter from a Birmingham jail, Martin Luther King Jr. Some people may have read it, some people may not have read it, some people may not understand the context of that. Tell us about that. So
I think that this is just one of these mandatory reading for all people. I think what's so powerful about it is that, first of all, he wrote it let me give you some historical context. He wrote it as a response to clergymen, both Christian and Jewish, who were basically saying that the demonstrations that they were doing the timing of it was unwise and untimely. And so he wrote that letter, 1963, from Birmingham jail. So there's so many beautiful words that he writes in there. And I think what is so powerful and what is so personal to me is that when you read it, and I would really beg people to read it, is that he could have written it in 2020. Which is why when people say things like, haven't we made progress? That is a hard statement for this person to hear, for me to hear. One of the lines that he puts in there is he says, I cannot sit idly by in Atlanta and not be concerned about what happens in Birmingham. And again, when I think of it in terms of whether we're talking race or we're talking spiritual things, Jesus, I have to be concerned beyond myself. And this goes back to what Allison was saying about this individual thing that is so important to us, that we lose sight of people.
Yeah.
And I shared with both you and Allison that my word these days is image bearer. Am I looking at people and saying they bear the image of Christ? And the question I would pose, we can say that about all of our loved ones. Do we see the image of Christ in them? Yes. But now the real hard work is when we see the homeless person, when we see the other, whoever the other is, do we see the image of Christ in them? And if we don't, let's acknowledge that and let's start there and ask God to work in our hearts with that. So when I read the letter from Birmingham jail, he's asking people for empathy, not apathy, which I think is what our current society kind of deals with. And he is trying to reach the hearts of people that are presumably faith-based people, and yet they are pushing back on his desire to achieve social justice.
Yeah.
It is a powerful piece. It is a must read.
Yeah. And that ties a little bit when you were emphasizing he was writing to ministers, he was writing to people like me in that day. And back to what Allison referenced, that's not that long ago. I mean, it's long ago if we think of it in one sense, but it's really recent if we think of it in another sense. So
I'm just going to interrupt for 1 second, Mike. 1963, many of us were walking around making sense in 1963.
I wasn't, but that's beside the point.
Yeah, I know. What are you talking about, Sharon?
Many of those people out there.
Yes.
You know
right.
what I'm saying? It's just, this is why it's hard for me to hear, haven't we made progress? Because in a lot of ways, no, we haven't. And who's making the determination on progress? Ask my dad. Ask my father-in-law.
Yeah, right. Okay, so I'm jumping around a bit, so you both know that. So don't, just hang with me. But I want to jump to this question because I know there are plenty of people within the Oak Hills Church universe who want to do more than have discussions about this. And I don't know what do more means, and I don't want to go all the way into that just yet, but I want to start tilting toward this idea of, okay, so we're in this tough conversation. We want to keep walking toward it. So let me ask the question this way, and this came from someone who submitted this, and I'm reading it as they wrote it. What does Oak Hills Church need to do differently within leadership and the congregation to be a signpost for racial reconciliation? Follow up. Are we content being, and this is a quote, alcoholics living over the pub, end quote. And then he says, N.T. Wright's words, not mine. And one caveat before you jump into this, I don't care who of you wants to answer it, but whenever we talk about what does Oak Hills Church need to do differently, it's really important to me that there's not any worry or concern of, okay, I got to step around this to not offend, to not insult, to not, make Mike or the staff or the other leaders of the church feel bad because of whatever. So you don't need me. You two certainly don't need me to tell you, don't worry about stepping on toes. What do you say to that? What do we need as a church to do differently in the leadership and the congregation, be a signpost for racial reconciliation?
Well, some of the things that come to mind for me is doing what we're doing right now, engaging in conversation and keeping Jesus at the forefront. I think another thing is to be a church, and I think we are a church of humility, and a church of service, which I think we are as well, because nothing can break our hearts more than kneeling before people and before God. So I think it's really important that we understand the power of humility, the power of prayer, Jesus's story. I think when we look at the Bible and we read about different situations where we are hearing about Jesus's encounters with people, that the tendency is to align ourselves with Jesus. And I think that we need to flip that a little bit and put ourselves in that other person, put ourselves in that Samaritan woman, put ourselves in the woman with the issue of blood, put ourselves in any other position but Jesus's position, and see how that might feel. And I actually, and this is what I love about Oak Hills, historically, at least for as long as I've been in Oak Hills, we have been a church that has really pressed in on that, about serving and about going deeper into our own stuff with the idea of living it out and being examples.
Okay. Good.
Can I add to that? Is there time for me to add?
You bet.
Okay, that was good stuff, Sharon. That was great. I would like to say, in addition to those things too, I think that the church, okay, and it applies to Oak Hills at various gradations that I'm familiar with and maybe not familiar with these days. How can we become attuned to our idolatry, which takes that great humility? How do we recognize that we haven't signed up for a country club? And again, that's not necessarily something that I'm labeling for Oak Hills. I'm saying this for how the church functions, how church functions, how we understand what our a baptism meant, how we understand the role of the church to effect new creation on earth in the ways that Sharon is talking about. If we really are focused on new creation, which is what N.T. Wright is trying to direct us towards, we would be really interested to make sure we understand the fullness of what that meant. And again, Sharon has described some of that. But we also would be extremely honest about how we have not only as individuals lived into that, we would understand how we have understood the church is a community that we're buying into that's doing that work. Our baptism is not, we are to Romans 6, 1-14, so we're to die and rise with Christ. And we're dying and rising with Christ in the fullness of what he is. His own baptism was forward thinking, right? It moved beyond him to all of us. And so he found it fit to come to save all who come unto him. But yet, oftentimes we see it unfit to make ourselves equally vulnerable with people. Same thing for the Eucharist. So I'm very much believing, and this I will say as an Oak Hill thing. Sorry, Mike. I'm probably gonna get in trouble. Is
I'll just delete you off this thing if you go too far.
understand what the sacraments mean. And I know Baptists don't like to necessarily hear the word sacraments. That's what they are. They're sacred. They're not only sacred, but they're sacrificial, but they're sacred. And so understand what those are, and maybe think we don't need to call them ordinances. They're sacraments. And what does it mean when you go to, and Mike's been beating on this drum for so long, what does it mean when you go to the Eucharist at the table? If you're bearing some harborage towards someone, why do we live with that? Why do we want to live in that space of which it makes leads the church in its own impotence? Because if it can't be done within the church, it's going to be impossible for the church to orient itself outward to that. Yeah. So also lamentation. Western churches don't particularly enjoy the idea of lamentation. It has to do with how we're wrapped up in our individualism. And I know that seems to be like this really bad buzzword these days. And I'm not a big buzzword person, so I always go, oh, sorry. But basically when, I like the way Augustine said it, when we turn inward to ourselves is sin. And so sin can, and also Luther modified Augustine on that, but when we're turning inward, then that is a place of sin. And so we can look at the inwardness and racism, we can look at it in other respects. But can we be honest with how we are addicted to that as a church and culture? And then we challenge our ideas of what is freedom. What constitutes freedom? Because we've gotten this language from the culture. Again, Jesus is Lord, right? Mm-hmm. Well, freedom is, it's inseparable from what human nature is, right? And to be free is to be able to flourish as one, as a one, as a kind of a being in a way. And that doesn't, I'm not talking about, I don't know where you guys are. I'm not speaking about politics here, but I'm not talking about like, oh, this smushy, let's all, be socialist stuff. That's not my point. So anyway, I've gone on. Oh yeah, there's this whole idea of trying to move forward from a place and then questing to a solution, which causes us to say, okay, we have a problem. And then we quest to a solution. And generally what that entails is we're calculating our own steps to get to the solution we think we need to. And so if the Western church is looking at the solution being, I got to get to heaven, then we'll walk through life constructing steps for that. If we think the solution is new creation, then we'll construct, under questing, and I have to give credit to Dr. Douglas Campbell, who's actually at St. Andrews right now, where N.T. Wright just retired. But if we're questing, then we're trying to construct steps to new creation solely in the context of our understanding. And the scriptures tell us we can't possibly fathom what God is up to except by our example of Christ, right? And the Holy Spirit. And then I have to go to one thing, the memoir. So if we actually look at where we stand in problem from what the solution is, new creation, we get right to what Christ is asking us to be. And then we can allow for, a retrospective look at where we've been and look at who Jesus was in that context as we have our eye towards what new creation actually looks like.
Okay.
I just want to add one other thing in terms of what should we be doing.
Yep.
For those of us who call ourselves Christians or Christ followers, even in the midst of this kind of tension, we should be, and especially when the church is trying to remain relevant, then we should be good examples of how you work things out. Instead of what we have right now, which are Christians being mad at other Christians. And there's the division that is happening in the world and in this country is going through neighborhoods, it's going through churches. And if we are Christians, I say this all the time in the cultural learning group, is Jesus not enough? Did he not give us examples on how to live? can we not come together or try? What are we doing? And it goes back to that thing you said months ago, Mike, whose banner are we flying? If we're all flying the Jesus banner, he should be enough for us to be able to have difficult conversations. And even if we don't walk away with a solution, we can hear things. Even if we don't agree with them, we could at least listen. Maybe our minds will change, maybe they won't. But can us who call ourselves Christ followers, can we not be a model to the world?
Yeah.
I mean, come on.
Yeah. Those are really powerful, combining what you both are saying and continuing to think about what a church like Oak Hills in Folsom, California, how to proceed, how to follow God's Spirit forward, what individual and communal new creation, meaning the life of Christ in us and flowing out of us, what does that look like? One of the things that as I hear both of you, that comes to mind as I think of it as one of the pastors of the church, how can we be a signpost for racial reconciliation? And what I want to do is get your thoughts on this. But when I think of that, I think I've noticed this in my own heart, praying for Oak Hills to continue to be a church filled with different people, different races, different perspectives on things, not for the sake of just to have a basket full of different things, but for the sake of to have a basket full of different things held together by what you guys are talking about, held together by our shared devotion and communion in Christ. The table then being this gathering of those who we may have differences, and those differences may prompt difficult conversations, but we live in submission to Jesus. So I want to ask you guys something related to all of this. As we think about Oak Hills, we think about proceeding. I want to share with you just a pastoral observation and see what your take is on it. We do have within our congregation, we have people who are tuning into this and thinking, you're not saying it strong enough. Say it firmer, say it tougher, push harder, because we're still hanging around, quote unquote, in the middle too much. So really drop the hammer and pull us deep into this, so our eyes are open to the severity of the problem of racism. There are other people tuning into this, listening to this. And by the way, I'm not reflecting on this because I know who's in this. That's not it at all. I just know who's in our church. I know the makeup of our church, and this is a good thing. There are differences. There are other people going, my goodness, we talk about this all the time. You know, Mike's given X number of talks about this since George Floyd was murdered. Here we are again. So what do you say to groups of people who might, for lack of a better way of putting it, trend one way? And let's not pretend there's a political quality to the way both these groups trend. One group might trend one way, one group might trend another way. And here's what I'm struck by, Allison, you said this a minute ago. If we can't do this in our own church, we've got no business advertising good news and reconciliation to this broader world. So the question is, how do, whether it be an individual on one side or an individual on another side, or a group on one side and a group on another side, how do we do this as a church? Allison, your phrase, how does the church be the church, a local church be the church, when there are these differences between us? And again, it's all under the heading of to be a signpost for racial reconciliation. I have a particular vision of what that would look like, but I'm curious, what do you guys say to the individuals or to the groups that are tuning into this, I trend this way, I trend that way. I can't believe people trend that the opposite way. I can't believe they trend this way. What do you say to all that?
You want to go first, Allie?
No, go ahead. You can start off. I can go first. Okay, that was a punt.
A football metaphor.
Football, there we go.
All right. Yeah. You know what, everybody, I struggle with this myself. I mean, this comes down to, I'll put it in my language, into me language. How do I understand that Jesus asks me to live? How do I understand what I've been taught throughout my Christian life with what I now know? How do those things correspond or not? One of the things that is revealing is, to the extent I am a product of what I've been taught by politics, I won't say secular society, but society, and also by narratives from Christianity that, like other aspects of our culture, have been about power. And just to be clear about what I'm saying is, you look at the record of Christianity in history and you can see where decisions were made to be a certain way. You can see where Thomas Jefferson and Monroe were having conversations with the early Christians, and they, in a friendly way. And this, don't get me wrong here. I'm of the opinion, be careful what you ask for. Okay, I'm a believer in the Constitution. I'm a believer in the Bill of Rights. It's quite masterful with amendments, right? So be careful what we ask for when we talk about deconstruction for the sake of ideology, but also we need to be careful on what we're accepting ideologically, because Christianity has been bent a certain way. I mean, one of the things that's striking to me is a statement of the American way. When you trace where that came from, and it's all wrapped up, with the statements of manifest destiny, all these things, but real quickly, when you trace that back, it became another creedal statement for political purposes, but at the same time, you had the same players involved who are doing the National Day of Prayer. And so this conflation, for me as a Christian, I have to look at those things and say, how have I been formed as a Christian in a way that is not representative of the church that Christ left behind? And if I'm not willing to do that, how am I calling myself a Christian? So that's what I would say about me.
Okay. Thank you. Sharon, anything to throw in there?
Well, I'm taking a different approach in that, how do we deal with this side versus this side?
Mm-hmm.
I think recognize the manipulation of news. I think you everybody knows I'm not a social media person. Get off of social media. Take responsibility of your knowledge base. And what that means is that we do the work. Mm-hmm. I recognize it's hard for some people to watch one station, and all that does is incite, bring up your blood pressure. Then do the work. Mm. Stop telling me about, don't stop telling me these sound bites. Do the work. Know why you feel the way you feel about something is, to me, where you start. Enter in so that you can say, you know what? I still don't agree, but at least you can at least ask a follow-up question.
Yeah.
It really, I mean, so much just begins with communication.
Yeah.
With communication. And then another thing that that comes to mind, and you got to stick with me on this because it's going to trail around. But years ago, we did a foot washing at Oak Hills, and I knew, I think I was on staff, so I knew we were going to do it. But I'm not a person who gets my toes done. And I was already like kind of panicked about that. And even when we did the foot washing, and part of the instruction was for those of us who were worried about our feet, don't get up and run to the restroom. Here's where I'm going with this. If you participated in that foot washing, it was one of the most sacred and beautiful and redemptive experiences I ever had. Washing someone's feet, having my feet washed, what my ugly toes looked like was immaterial. It was beautiful. And here's my point, if you're still trying to figure out what the point is. Walk into the deep. You might learn something. Don't just take face value for stuff. Do the work. Enter in. Push back against the no's, no way, oh heck no. And just walk in, do the work.
That's good. That's good. I want to go, we have two more questions that I want to bring up. And one of them was submitted by someone, and I'm going to just take it as they submitted. I fully support the peaceful protest marches that have gone on in various cities across the United States after Black men have been killed by police officers. However, I am also greatly concerned about the tenets of organizations like Black Lives Matter and the apparent anarchy and violence breaking out in many cities. Is my perspective accurate, or would you say it is a racist point of view?
I like that question. I mean, they're all good. Yeah, N.T. Wright made a good point on this, and Martin Luther King is in the same vein. I think nonviolence is something that people who are desiring for resolution usually will seek nonviolence. Those that are disciples of Christ, I would say in general, that's how I say it. Now, hear me, I'm not judging anybody who's out doing violence. I don't know the reasons for that. On the Black Lives Matter thing, I come from the perspective that the statement Black Lives Matters is important, but I don't know all of what the organization is about, but I will say that what it sounds like to me, it is the same thing we've been talking about, is that we Christians are getting bogged down by the ideologies that are fed to us. And so if we aren't discerning through the gospel what is being provided to us, and it could be Black Lives Matter, or it could be the American way of life. They're the same. I'm not talking about Black Lives Matter statement. These things have to be viewed as what are they doing in the way of my understanding as a Christian, and how do they comport with the way Jesus has asked me to live? Now, if the American way of life does it, oh, well, okay. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. If it's the Black Lives Matter, we have to be wise and discerning about what the scriptures are telling us. But I do think that we have to also take out our own agendas, because we are locked into very, very polarized
Yeah.
opinions about these things.
And if I can throw in, I don't care what side, and it isn't a two-sided thing, it's multifaceted. I don't care what angle someone's at with these things. Your comment about discernment and effect, your comment about, I gotta hone in on what Jesus is calling me to. I'll just say this just definitively, as far as I'm concerned, none of us can do that on our own, in isolation, only surrounded by those who already agree with what we think. Because all that is, if I can take your statement earlier, Allison, that is questing and putting people around me who are questing in the same direction I am, and they're applauding me as I'm doing exactly the same thing that they're doing. And so my ability to discern what is the Jesus way in this, my ability to sort through where's my agenda in this, one of the primary reasons for the community of God's people, so we can be in each other's lives, sometimes in confrontive ways, to sharpen and sort all that out together. So, Sharon,
And
did
it
you
does
have
require not being around the people who agree with you in the church.
Yes,
too.
exactly. Again, if your comment earlier, if we can't do this in the church, if we can't be people of reconciliation, not defined as we all agree together, we can't live under the shadow of the cross and in the goodness of God's grace and the shalom together with those who are Christ followers. We can't do that with those who are Christ followers but different in the church. We have no message. We have no credibility to go blasting out, screaming at all the division in the world, because it just boomerangs back on us if we can't. And again, you guys have both said this, and we can't do this. Sharon said this, so I'm gonna remind everybody that Sharon said we can't do this if everything we're doing is behind a computer or on social media. We have to be with each other in our differences. We have to, as part of that, do the work, Sharon, you said, we have to walk toward each other, even though we may differ. So Sharon, I don't know if I cut you off, but did you have a comment on that?
Amen.
Okay, last thing, and then we're gonna wrap this up. And again, submitted by someone. Actually, two more things. The last, though, I just want you guys to talk about the cultural learning group. So here's the last question. Someone submitted, read pretty much as submitted. And Allison, I'll aim this one at you. What is the thinking of the story and the testimony of Candace Owen and her journey to the Blexit movement, and defined as the systemic treatment of certain and specific ethnicities as victims rather than capable human beings, thereby keeping them in an inferior and dependent position?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm vaguely familiar with Candace. For folks who don't know her, basically she's a talking head, an author, a pundit, an activist. She used to be on the liberal side of the political aisle, and she left. She's Black. She left the side to go to conservatives, and she contends things such as that Black Lives Matter and other things are facilitating victim mentality by Black populations. So in summary, yeah, that's an interesting question. What I would say about that is it goes back to the the same thing we've been talking about. First of all, this is a different point. Multiple things can be true at the same time. And I think that for some reason, and I'm not saying it about this question, but it reminds me, I'm encountering a lot of people these days who have to have the truth, what they say is true their way, which is like if we really believe that Jesus is foundation, that's like sort of this foundationalism perspective, is that there's so many truths out there that whatever you want to make up, and that is, I won't go into what all that is. Anyway, on Candace, many of the things she's saying can be agreed with. If you look at what Martin Luther King even wrote, he struggled in that letter from Birmingham Jail. He struggled with the variation and texture of what was happening with Blacks. I mean, you had Martin Luther King being violent. You had other Blacks who he said, gosh, come on, let's get going. Don't be the victim mentality, and then on and on. So what Candace is saying doesn't necessarily always need to be seen as true or as gospel, okay? And her experience in changing that, and I'm not a follower of hers, reminds me of just how we can be deceived again by politics, and we need to be focused on the politics of Jesus. Why does it matter what Candace is saying about either of these cases as an argument? Is kind of where my mind goes. Why is this even an argument? She's changed parties, and she has found parties wanting. How about that? There is no party that is the party of Jesus. With that said, everyone should discern in community what is going on ideologically in parties. So multiple things can be true at the same time, and we don't always have to have the truth constructed in the way we makes us feel validated. That's what I can say about her and that question.
Okay. Sharon, anything to add to that?
I guess I would just say, because I have read some of her stuff, is that we can always find people to agree with what we want to agree with. And it goes back to this side and this side. And I'm trying to get us that side.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And you know, we've chatted a lot about this tonight, and we certainly are on the same page with regard to our responsibility as Christ followers is to follow Christ, is to look to him, etc. And what's also true to your point, Allison, in terms of two things can be true at the same time, is we live in a country where there's a political theater, and there tends to be a Democratic side and a Republican side. And there are, you know, right now, we're at the very front edge of that fun season that we're going to be entering into, and the push and the pull and the tug of war. So the point is this desire for the politics of Jesus, and then the reality we're in of a political climate, neither of whom is going to thoroughly advocate the politics of Jesus. So we're in this messy struggle, having to sort out and dialogue and work through, and it creates quite it's a challenge. It's the temptation for us as Christians and as Oak Hills Church. If COVID has put a certain amount of pressure on us individually and on us as a church, if these racial issues have put pressure on us, now we are about to add the political bricks that will add more pressure. I just think it's crucial for us to recognize we have a calling here. It doesn't mean we're not going to vote. It doesn't mean we're not going to have to accept less than the perfect ideal. It doesn't mean that all this stuff works out neatly, but it does mean we are entering an arena where we already have burdens and pressures, and they're about to increase. and I'll just leave it at this, that Christ may be formed in us so our witness in this world has credibility. And that has to do with who we are together and how we are together, not who we're screaming at, who we're clicking like on, who we're clicking dislike on. Has to do with who we are together, coming together, conversing, talking, even debating, disagreeing, even challenging each other in deep and confrontive ways out of love and by being present with each other. So both of you, let's wrap this up. This question of ongoing, this question of how do we keep on this road? Somebody submitted a great question about how do we stay in this without the crisis driving us into it. I thought it was a wonderful thing to reflect on. How do we keep this conversation and this, not just the conversation, but the journey going when perhaps there are no massive flare-ups that grab the nation's attention? And so both of you have been instrumental in the cultural learning group. So would like one of you to, or maybe Sharon, let me ask you, if you would explain what that is, explain a little bit of how it came to be, and just talk about how that can be a very concrete way people who may be tuned into this could continue on the journey.
Well, Mike, I'm going to defer to Allison because the cultural learning group really came from inside the mind of Allison and the heart of Allison. So I'm going to let her explain that, and then I'll hop back in.
Okay, sounds good.
Okay, so in 2016 we were in a similar moment as we are today, only it's protracted and more rigorous. I was burdened by the fact that it appeared to me that the church, and explicitly Oak Hills, was stressing and suffering from not talking to each other and having deep-seated feelings that I felt were tearing us apart. And so this was put together for the sake of bringing multiple different kinds of people to actually share what it is about their lives and that they experience. And the net of it is that it was really intended to help people hear their neighbor, hear their brother and sister on the truth of things that they would not say to them. And it was astounding at how many people, at the work it took to get people together to do that work. And Sharon knows this by now because she's been running it for years now. But it was essential to start with the church, because Christ is manifest through the church. And when I say church, I'm not talking about a building. I think you guys know that. So the repair of the church is essential because there is going to be a church. The question is, will Christ know our name? Will Christ know our name when we stand up and say, well, we were your church? It's a big concern I have for what it is that Christ has asked us to do. So the cultural learning group was intended to start that conversation. And that's where I'll leave off, Sharon.
And okay, go ahead, Sharon.
So in a practical sense, we have gotten about 20-ish people together, different backgrounds, and we share experiences with each other, making no judgments. But the idea is that you are learning learning from another person's experience. And so whether that is a racial situation, we've had people that were in law enforcement share a perspective that was very good for many of us to hear. We've had people from other cultures that have shared. And for me, I can just say I've shared it each time, is that I got insight into lives I knew nothing about. And I realized how much I didn't know, but my curiosity was piqued, relationships formed, hearts were softened, conversation continued. And I feel like we were, during those meetings, the way we're supposed to be, the way God intended. These were just beautiful conversations with no judgment, in learning humility postures.
10 weeks, Sharon, is that right?
It was, I think we did 110, and I think the last one I believe was 9.
Okay, so it's a weekly thing over a period of time, and over the few years we've done this, each group has been comprised of people who are different in age, huge differences in age, different ethnicities, different socioeconomic, different politics, sometimes not just different politics in name, but widely different in terms of how their perspectives are. So these group of people who are different in all these different ways, but who share in common a desire to follow Jesus, coming together to listen and to learn from each other. So I bring this up because some of you who are tuned in may be looking for a way to continue to grow in these things we're talking about, to make practical this idea. How do I walk towards somebody who thinks differently than me on this? Is there a forum to do that? The Cultural Learning Group is the forum to do that. Obviously, we're in a strange time with COVID, and but we're trying to make plans. We're in the early stage of making plans to have a cultural learning group begin sometime this fall in whatever format we can make it work. Here's the point. If you're interested in this, if this piques your curiosity, if you go on the Oak Hills website, or you can write it down right now, whichever it is, but Ashley Hansen is the person to email. It's Ashley, A-S-H-L-E-Y, Hansen, H-A-N-S-E-N, @oakhills.org. If you don't remember that, you can go onto the website and you'll find her under the staff listing. You can email her and just simply say, hey, I'm interested in the cultural learning group, so can you keep me posted when those plans come together as to how we're going to do it. Well, thank you both, Sharon and Allison, for vulnerability, for insight, for being willing to participate in this and stoke the fire and keep the conversation going. And thank you to those of you who tuned in. We appreciate you being part of this. I appreciate, as one of your pastors, I appreciate so many people wanting to step into this, as both Allison and Sharon mentioned earlier, willing to step into it, willing to stay in it. It's just very good. It's very healthy. It indicates something about who we are. And back to one of those questions, it's part of the journey. And I think we're on a good journey to being a church that understands racial reconciliation and is doing our part toward it. So thank you again for being with us tonight. And we're going to sign off, and may the peace of Christ be with you all. Good night, everyone.